So yeah, just off the back of what Nicola was talking about in terms of the benefits virtual worlds bring, and she mentioned that we linked up on one of the projects that she was working on when I was at the University of Greenwich. I was just starting a project which was to be looking at virtual worlds used by children on the autism spectrum, and that was part of my PhD study. Specifically, I was focused or concerned with how users with autism represented themselves in virtual worlds, or in a virtual world, which was Second Life, and this Virtaut island that you may have seen or will be seeing in a bit. So it was concerned with how they represent themselves, how they communicate, and how appropriate those communication conversations are. The reasons for investigating those three areas were because they were areas that hadn't been investigated before and that we didn't really know the answers to. And in order to uncover that, I conducted an exploratory case study with a school that I linked with, Linden Bridge School, again, as Donna mentioned earlier on. And as you can imagine, getting the buy-in and certainly getting the support of a school was absolutely central in my particular study, but I would argue in any study being successful, having the teachers on board and the students on side, so to speak, as well as technical infrastructures, and then having obviously how to involved was very beneficial, and again certainly was central in the success of this project. So there's a few facets of the project that sort of essentially came together in order to enable this exploration of representation, communication, and social conventions within a virtual world. So on top of all of that, of course, also, and as Nicola has mentioned earlier on, the area of safety was very important in terms of me taking an appropriate ethical stance in my work. So in other words, ensuring that the school children, they were between 14 and 16, so ensuring that they were safe. As we know, virtual worlds in the main are open and anybody can access them, but it was particularly important for the student safety and for the parents to have confidence in the project, and even for the school to engage in the project at all, that the island was totally safe and secure. In other words, it was locked down, and only the users in this study, the teachers and myself, were able to access the island at any time, that nobody could join, and that the students couldn't leave and access any other parts of Second Life. So again, through we kind of worked together to get that sorted. And then, of course, we sought and received ethical approval from all of the participants in the study, which was, absolutely essential and vital, certainly in terms of conducting a study, in the public domain, in the school in the UK. That was very important. In terms of actually designing the island, having conducted various research in a variety of areas, in some best practice and so on, I decided to create a variety of different areas on the island, and this was on the original Virtaut island, of course. And those areas ended up including quiet spaces, funfair and group activity spaces and tasks, eateries, various transport activities. There was a zoo and some animals, a central hub and an information centre, and some markets and shops. And these were clustered together around various different parts of the island. And the reasons for creating these various parts were due to the tasks that I developed with the teachers. So the case study was run over 9 weeks, and every week for about an hour and a half, the students would engage in some structured and some scaffolded tasks, worksheets that they had to work through that would engage them with various parts of the island. And that would include things like going to a shop, queuing for a coffee, ordering a coffee, taking a seat, and catching up with one of their class friends in the classroom. And of course, that was done to judge the various communication channels they used, or to measure what communication channels they used, how appropriately they used those, And again, that was measured against various criteria that was established in previous studies. And those tasks were observed and notes were taken in terms of what happened and what activities happened. And again, those were discussed in the, in the report that I ended up producing. It was also felt that due to the various aspects of the autism condition that there was some quiet spaces available on the island for students to potentially go off to should they want a more quiet space. As I did note in the classroom that they had sort of chill out areas or areas where students could go to if they wanted to take a bit of a time out. So those areas were included on the island, although having done the study, they weren't particularly very well utilised, so I'm not too sure how useful they are within these spaces. The most popular spaces included things like coffee shop, there was a McDonald's, there was an arcade centre and dodgems and various other fun fair activities. They proved very, very popular. So activities that students would do together or that they would typically do together in the real world were fairly popular, it appeared. In terms of, I guess, some of the findings from the study, if that's of any interest, firstly, avatar customization in a 3D virtual world, in this 3D virtual world, Second Life, by users with autism seemed to be quite limited. They didn't deviate much from the default model. In fact, users with autism reported a preference for designing and customizing a 2D avatar compared to a 3D avatar. So I think there's some implications there, certainly within 3D virtual spaces, of course. And as the case study progressed over the 8-9 weeks, there was little desire to continue modifying their avatar, where when we look at other studies that involve typically developing users, we start to see that, or we see that there's a much more of a preference for them to continue customizing and modifying their avatar as time progresses. Secondly, that text chat was the preferred means of communication in the virtual world. Audio was not an option, I must say, at this point. But, and as we were talking about earlier, there's various gestures and there's various animations, motion captured animations, and of course there's text chat are available to users. Now, when we again ran this with a typically developing group, we found that they were much more freely used facial gestures and body movements, whereas the ASC, or the Autism Spectrum Condition Group, did not use them at all. So text chat was by far the preferred means of communication in the virtual world. And we did see there that the text chat tended to increase over the time for most of the participants. However, again, interestingly, the users with autism tended to only communicate with people with whom they knew who they were communicating. So in other words, as we see around the room here, some of you don't have your real life names displayed, but rather some generic sort of Second Life name. Until the users had their real life names attached, we found that the children with autism didn't want to communicate as freely as they ended up doing once we had the names attached. Finally, the research identified that participants with autism communicated extensively using text chat, and that the majority of these communication were coded as being appropriate. Although this was fairly variable, as we found some users were coded as communicating 100% appropriately, and some were found to only communicate 40% of their interactions in an appropriate fashion. So there was quite some variance there, and I think there's some sort of further need for research within that area, which is an interesting aspect of computer-mediated communication, I think. And to come back sort of full circle then, I guess, in terms of Nikki's affordance, as she was talking about the affordances there of virtual worlds, yes, I think through the case study and through the observations that were taken, it certainly appeared that users in this study anyway found communicating within the virtual world certainly less scary, less daunting. They reported finding the communication to be at a slower pace, so they were more able to think about and process answers and responses to a communication exchange, which is obviously, again, another affordance that these type of communication, modes of communication can bring. And of course, this is probably down to various cognitive loads being lessened within these spaces, which very much links to more traditional computer-mediated communication theories, where things like online communication have been assessed and judged to have similar affordances. And also, I think research previous to the research I've conducted had identified that ideally and preferably virtual worlds are most beneficial for people with an IQ above 70. And again, the group that I was working with certainly would have fallen within this category, although they all had a diagnosis of autism. Again, that finding very much bore out within the work I did or conducted. In terms of just sort of personal reflections, I think, as I said, we were very lucky, or I was very lucky. We had there was a technical support manager at the school, there was a teacher who wanted to champion this, and then there was How To, who were able to help with some of the design and the setup. And without those three sort of facets, I think the actual technical design of this project would have proved very difficult. And it kind of, all those things working, kind of allowed it to happen. So I think they shouldn't be underestimated with any of the work that we do moving forward. A framework was identified in terms of best practice in going from the very start of a project like this right the way through to the very end, and that's certainly something I can circulate. And just briefly, that contained 4 stages. The first one being the selection of a virtual world, which is important in terms of the features, the technical considerations, and the teacher familiarization or the user group familiarization. Phase 2, which was the design and the development of the virtual world and of the project more broadly. And here, contextual considerations are important. Things like room space and layout, school equipment, individual user needs, and things like bandwidths and ports. So being able to communicate with the virtual world externally to the school needs consideration. Key stakeholders within that exchange, you have the technical support, the users themselves, the teachers, and even the local education authority within a UK context. The third phase was the evaluation, and within my study, I was, as I said, concerned with the experiences of these user groups. So it was a case study where I was observing and asking them about their experiences, and then to come to some conclusions, as I've explained. And then, of course, include teacher and student feedback as well as observations of what was happening. And the final phase, of course, is the data analysis there. So how the data is coded and how we make sense of that information, which I've only kind of touched on here, but the data that I had and how I treated it led to those sort of 3 main findings that I've hopefully described in some detail. I hope that's given a kind of an overview of the project, where it came from, and the journey that I took with it, and some of the findings that came out of it. I'm not too sure how interesting they are per se, but to you necessarily, but certainly through engaging with the project, various infrastructures within the school and options that I had accessible to me were certainly very key in the success of a project like this. So I guess at this point, Donna and Nikki, I know both have my email, and I'm sure the rest of you have been copied in, but I will put that in the text box here. Should you have any questions, any specific sort of questions of things that I've touched on. I mean, if there's anything now that we can take, I'll be more than happy to answer anything. But I can certainly address sort of more specific and detailed questions perhaps over email if that's an appropriate fora for you all.